welcome everybody who has joined us today on this Creating Value and Impact in Networks webinar. This actually is a joint webinar between the participants who've been joining us on previous webinars on Source for Networks, and a very big welcome to our colleagues from the Virtual Academy of Large-Scale Change. Professor Becky Mulvey will be actually presenting the webinar, and I'll just do a very brief introduction. So at this stage, I'm just going to give some quick background, a very brief overview of who we are and where we are. I'll let you read Becky's short profile there. If you want to know more about any of us who are involved in the Source for Networks platform, then if you go onto the platform, you can actually read some of our blogs there. So I'm not going to spend any time on that, as those are resources that are available elsewhere. I would, however, like to mention our backroom team, particularly Rachel and Claire, and those who help in the background to make this actually work. So a very big thank you to all of them. Just would like to put some context into why the Source for Networks and why the Large-Scale Change Program as well. The purpose of all the work that we do within the Sustainable Improvement Team, which sits in NHS England, is to support the top 10 priorities of the 5-year forward view. And that includes the large-scale change and the networks and the collaboration between the two programs. So for those of you who perhaps haven't seen any of the large-scale change stuff at this stage, then there is a publication which is available through the website, and that can be obtained at www.england.nhs.uk/large-scale change. And you can also join us in any conversations in Twitter using the hashtag large-scale change. So effectively, to support leaders who deliver large-scale transformational change, the Sustainable Improvement Team and the Horizons team refreshed and updated the previous publication from 2011, which was a practical guide to leading large-scale change. And this basically reflects some of the changing landscape and challenges that have occurred in the last few years. I would recommend it as a read. It's a very interactive document, lots of links to other sites and PDFs, etc. So I would very much welcome that people actually take time to reflect on that. So just a little bit of context of where Sustainable Improvement and the Networks program sits. Our role is to lead and champion and support the effective use of networks to drive improvement and transformational change. And within that, we provide access to various tools and diagnostics and background to the evidence behind networks to strengthen and improve the impact of networks. And in doing that, it's about supporting the leadership of those networks to confidently lead those networks and respond to a very challenging and complex environment. A quick look at the some of the information that is available in the Source Network program platform. Again, I'll just let you take a second to read that. So this is a webinar in a series of webinars, the final one of which will take place on the 11th of December, and they always take place at the same time between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock UK time. And you can see the link there at the bottom of that slide as to where you can find out more information about this. This is a unique challenge for us today in terms of bringing together the two cohorts from the large-scale change and the networks platform. It will be fairly pacey. It's going to be a lot of information in there. The place of networks in large-scale change is well covered in section 3 of the large-scale change guide, and I would again urge people to take time to read that so that you actually get the context for this. We will cover a lot of concepts that are relatively challenging to absorb in a short space of time. So the slide deck has been previously shared up on the platform, and it will also be posted as a recording today after the webinar. So we will transcribe this webinar as well as posting the slides and the recording. We're also going to be holding a question and answer session in the community page on the Source for Networks site, and it would be great to see many of you there joining us in that. So without any further ado, I see Becky's already on video, and I'm going to hand over to you at this point, Becky. Thank you.
Hi all, how's that? How's the sound? So I can hear that you're having real trouble, some of you, with sound. So just post in the chat box. Oh, good. Thanks, Alison. I'm going to keep an eye open for you. It's really great to see some good friends on this call. Welcome to QI Fellows, to the Darcy Fellows. It's lovely to see some of you familiar names again. We've got nearly 200 people on this, so I'm going to do my absolute best to try and connect with you all, but we're just going to have to hope, because it's like crowd management in relation to this. So here we go. What's this webinar about? I'm going to do a quick, brief overview of networks for you, because some of you are new into these webinar series. So just a quick view of what they're about, and then we're going to get right into governance and into impact. And these are quite tricky territories. On the Source for Networks website, you'll see there's something called Learning Space. There are 2 blogs up there at the moment about impact and governance. So there's some really only a page, so you can get the sort of the gist of it there, as well as, of course, the slides. Okay, let's go. Okay, context for networks. So if you can see, the world is moving from this, from the left-hand side, the from column to the right-hand side. And this is about moving from an individual focus to a population focus, from increasing access, Jeremy Hunt's favourite term at the moment, very unhelpful, I find, into reducing demand, which is much more helpful. How do we work with the assets of communities? How do we manage the relationship between a dependency-creating state and an asset and enabling and empowered community? And I don't know if any of you follow Alison Cameron on Twitter, you'll know that she basically says that we'll all be empowered if you lot would get out the way. And that's partly, I think, this new world we're in, which is one of partnerships rather than consumers, one of interdependency rather than dependency, one of evidence-based decision-making rather than hunches, one of self-managed teams, one of networks, and one of learning. And there's high-performing health systems in the world, for those of you that follow that, Nuka, Intermountain, Jönköping, Bertzog in the Netherlands. They're absolutely based on these models, and the work that we are doing at my organisation in relation to primary care is absolutely based on these models. And one thing that we've been able to show is if you move over to that right-hand side, you can do absolutely more with the resources that you've got. And it's a fantastic way of managing the real difference in who presents now into the NHS. So if you think what the NHS was all set up for, it was set up for disease management, and now we're into multiple comorbidities by the time people reach their 70s and 80s, particularly their 80s, a completely different model of demand. And so our NHS has designed, it wasn't really fit for purpose. And so this is the challenge we're in. And networks are the absolute best way of organising in relation to having an adaptive creative response to challenges where no one knows exactly what to do. And so that's the context for networks. And this is the way that high-performing health systems and big corporates are organising these days. So just before we get going on the real content of it, just if you could just pop in the chat box for me what you're curious about whilst I'm talking, and then I'll come back to it in a minute. So pop, if you can have a look at the chat box, and we'll get on with that. Okay. So how work gets done. There are three main ways that work gets done in any organisation or any system. And we mostly talk about, don't we, about accountable care systems these days. Those are bounded places where decisions get made by multiple partners and stakeholders. Now, those are adaptive systems. That's the bottom of these. Mostly working with complex, wicked issues. They tend to be temporary issue-based, and you are intertwined by the nature of your relationships and the place in which which services are delivered. So when you're talking about the adaptive space, I'm talking about a geographical place. We're talking about networks. These are cooperative structures. They're fantastic for wicked issues. They're based on peers and reciprocity, and they primarily have a knowledge function. They're about getting knowledge in and out in order to develop services and for people to learn. So they're much, much more creative. They're more innovation focused. They're also around wicked issues, but they tend to be issue-based rather than place-based. So adaptive systems, place-based networks tend to be more issue-based. And for those of you who are interested in the types of networks and which of those can be done through delivery systems, you need to go and have a listen into one of the previous webinars where we talked about the types of networks that exist. I'm not going to go into that now. And then at the very top is hierarchy, which you're very familiar with, where the world is linear, where you have a deterministic relationship between inputs and outputs, where it's standardized and where you can manage through performance management systems. And that relates to a very small amount of the overall work in the NHS. I don't know what your understanding is about where hierarchy is best placed, but for those of you who start thinking about when you've been involved in hierarchical work and where it works, then it's things like getting people paid. You know, it's the absolute fundamentals of some of those things that are absolutely necessary and completely manageable, but they're not necessarily ones that are wicked difficult and need more creative solutions. So if you think that network work is wicked, not tame, and I've just given an example, at the top is a picture of something that I think is tame, you know, and you sort of hope it is, that if someone goes in for a hip replacement, they come out having had a hip replacement, and that there are steps that people follow in that to make it safe, to make sure that people get the right hip replacement, to make sure that the surgery is absolutely in line with that person's condition. Now, the issue about tame is not that it's easy. Tame is, just keep remembering, tame is linear. Tame is about if you do X, Y always happens. So it can be really complicated. Getting someone on the moon is tame. Getting the Channel Tunnel built is tame. When you build a tunnel, you know that when you know what success looked like. When the two halves of the Channel Tunnel met, you know that you've built the Channel Tunnel. So when you're thinking about tame work, it's not necessarily easy. It's where we know that every step we take is predetermined and will give you the results you expect. In the wicked world, every step you take, it's a waterbed world. Some things work and some things pop up that you don't expect. So when you do X, Y could happen, but so could A, B, and C. Okay, let's have a quick look at what people are interested in. Glad to see the sounds working. Everyone seems to have a different understanding of networks. Absolutely, Priya. And so the issue about networks is some people think about managed networks or clubs. And there is a real difference between a hierarchy, an adaptive system, a network, and then a sort of membership organization for in a sort of passive way. Networks are absolutely based on reciprocity. Everybody makes a contribution. In clubs, you have passive recipients. People pay a fee. They get services. It's quite a different notion of a network. So I think probably if you're thinking about the difference, you might think about a learning network, a community practice versus the AA or the RAC. So if you're thinking about those two, that might help you make those sorts of distinctions. Now, getting on to thinking about what you're interested in. So we've got this, you're talking about how do you get people to work together, how do you motivate people, how do you demonstrate impact, how people, the nice one you've talked here, Wendy, you're saying about it's okay if people jump on and off. The thing about networks is that they are resilient to membership changes. So if you've got a very strong purpose, the network, and all members know that, you can tolerate people coming and going. Okay, so let's come back to those as we work through today. All right. So just being clear about what networks are good at and the purpose of them and what makes them work. So networks have a very clear shared purpose, and this is the piece that everyone needs to be coming back to on a regular basis. Again, we've done a webinar on this, and there is a page up on the website. So if you're very clear what your purpose is, i.e. why you're in it together, why are you doing this work in this way, what is it that you really care about, is everybody absolutely clear? And this is very important for us when we're getting into the value piece later on, because if you don't know what your purpose is, you can't demonstrate impact against it. So being clear what your purpose is, having a clear purpose statement, one that all your members are signed up to, that's why they've joined, that's really critical. So the next piece is equality. So networks are equal spaces where everybody makes a contribution, and there is a level of generosity and sharing in a network, and a word that some people find harder, which is reciprocity, i.e. give and take, and everybody making a contribution to that. And actually network members tend to collectively keep people in or ask people to leave based on the nature of that reciprocity. So people take leadership roles in networks over specific issues. So you might at one stage be leading some effort within a network, and you might at another stage be a recipient of some of the value in the network. People take all those roles within it. But at every one time, as a group of peers, you're collectively responsible. So whilst you might nominate a network leader, it's not in a hierarchical sense, it's not in a performance management sense. The network leader doesn't then go and do all the work. The network leader is a facilitator, a creator, and enabler. And again, subject of actually the last network webinar series. The things that make networks work around diversity is about difference. And again, this is really important when we're coming on to the governance piece, because you do want network members that have very different diverse views. And it's the creativity comes out of people working together with these significantly diverse views in service to purpose. And you struggle and you generate knowledge and you try and find ways through quite difficult issues. And that's a really, really important part of network membership. It gives them their lifeblood and their innovation. So diversity is critical, but it makes governance really difficult. And that's what we're going to come to in about 10 minutes' time. So networks have clear rules of engagement. Etiquette is probably a nice way. It's like dinner party stuff. It's how do we know how to behave together? They're good at peer working. You absolutely review. If you think about a professional model of supervision and peer review, start thinking about that in relation to networks. You collectively review how we're doing, and you could do that through the diagnostics page of our website. They're based on resourcefulness and trust, so they really take an asset brace, looking at what can every member contribute and how can you do that together. And so this, when you're going back to when I was talking about transitions earlier on, this asset knowledge-based model is absolutely critical. And then trying things out iteratively. So networks do this cycles. They have got space and room to innovate, which just means prototyping, seeing what works, and then moving on if things don't work. Okay, so you can see what they're useful for. And there are these types of functions in networks. I'm just going to ask you in a minute to start reading these about which one you think your network does. So networks do a range of things, but on the whole of that list, most people join networks for the amplifying piece, and particularly learning networks. So you have a lone voice, but when you're in a network, your voice is amplified by everybody else having a similar purpose, and so it's easy to be heard, or you can get your points across, you can make yourself visible. So the sorts of networks that amplify tend to be lobbying groups. And then if you think about how what networks can do about generating community, trying to be filters, lots of people in the NHS say, I don't really know what the knowledge is out there. Our Primary Care Quality Academy is a network. We try and generate the best intelligence there is about primary care development. It goes up on my blog. We use that to shape and support members. And so our part of the network is that knowledge filtering piece. And that's the role South Bank plays in the network. Okay, so you've had a quick look at those. So if you have quick go on the poll now, the network that you're involved in, that you're thinking about in relation to this webinar, what work does your network do? Rachel, if you could put the poll up, that would be fabulous. And I can have a quick look at the, whilst you're doing that, I want to have a quick look at the chat. Okay. How to build skills to maintain and grow networks? Great to good. Generating value is difficult. Okay, all right. So you do your poll, and I'm going to carry on. It's going to stay up in your chat box, so you've got a minute, I think, left to do your poll, and we'll see what sort of work you do. And I'm going to get going on how work gets done in networks. So when you're thinking about networks, relational, creative, knowledge sharing, and they have these distinctive features. And this is really important when getting into the governance and into the value creation, because it's about distributed power. And that's really critical when you're thinking about the generating a view of impact is crucial, because nobody continues their contribution to a network if they can't see the impact that's being generated. So whilst there are fluctuations in their member engagement, you're always going to be seeking some level of secure impact. Okay, so there's some sense of what's distinctive about networks. I'm going to go straight in now into governance and networks. So why does this matter? So let's get going on that. Okay. All right, so this is quite a contrived a quote, so hopefully you get a chance to read it. and you can see that, and this is interesting, because if you see now in your poll that primarily your networks are about facilitating, some of you not answering, some of them about generating community. So when you're thinking about governance in relation to these, you've got to think, what's the focus of our work as a network, and therefore how do we govern that? So if you're thinking about governance, in this sense, we're talking about networks securing shared purpose, which adds some value to their members. So that's what you've got to think. You've got shared purpose, adding value to members. And in public services, we're talking about adding value to members and to the public sphere. Okay, so that's the third piece. So generating value, clear shared purpose, generating value to members and the public sphere. And the governance process is the process by which members create shared decisions. And that's decisions about what work they're going to do and decisions about whether they have made the impact they need to do. And the way you do that, the governance process, if you can see this, we're talking about these mutually dependent but operationally autonomous factors. That's your members. Members are independent. You subscribe into, you volunteer into, you participate in networks, but you do that as an autonomous agent, usually representing an organization or representing particular views or taking particular views. And then you're going to have to work through the very diverse views in the network. And the governance framework is riddled with these sorts of issues. So if you've got diverse views who are potentially conflict-ridden, and that's not a negative sense. Conflict is a very important asset for networks. It generates loads of energy. But if you've got that sort of conflict, those diverse views, the governance framework has to enable that to come to fruition in service to those rules of thumb, the etiquette, the way we do business around here that frames the way a network works. So you've got to be able to work through those diverse views to reach shared decisions, and those shared decisions are about your impact, your purpose, and your assets. And this is really important. So the assets in any network tend to be intellectual property, shared knowledge, some finances, because people might be making contributions or you might have generated grants, and the people resources. So when you're thinking about how you govern a network, you're governing the intellectual property, the knowledge base, the finances, and the people, and you're doing that through a quality-based, distributed process. So you can see already that this doesn't feel familiar to most governance processes. So I'm going to ask you to, in the chat box now, could you just put there what you think governance? What do you think when I say the word governance? What comes up for you? What's that mean for you? Okay. Accountability, safety, community, risk management, transparency, accountability, responsibility. Yeah, absolutely. Rules that govern the way we work. Okay, so what's really nice in what you're putting in about accountability and responsibility. So what I see in the NHS is masses of the language around accountability and very little follow through. So when partners welch on or don't follow through or don't do in a partnership relationship the things they said they would do, holding those to account and asking people to take responsibility collectively for what happens is really, really difficult. And so I don't see a massive amount of that. And you're spot on, Sally. Accountability, transparency, and responsibility are absolutely what governance is about. But it's really interesting is that a lot of governance in the NHS is held behind closed doors. It's project management papers. It's risk profiling. It's very, very rarely about accountability and responsibility. So when you're thinking about networks, you can't assume that people know how to use it. They'll use this language. Doesn't mean to say they know how to act, and that's really important. Sorry, so I'm just going to go back a second to what you were saying there. So when you're thinking about good governance, it's a process for making and implementing decisions. It's not about making correct decisions. It's the best possible process for making the decisions that the members want to take collectively in a network. So good governance usually involves transparency, spot on, responsiveness, i.e. meeting members' needs, consensus, that's not in a wishy-washy way, but all members in the network have to agree. Equity and inclusiveness is part of governance in a network, effectiveness and efficiency, accountability. You have participation, so you can't have governance in a network that doesn't engage all the members. You can't do it separately from the membership. And that's usually quite significantly different from governance in hierarchies. And there is some rule of law in governance. The sort of the regulations, the legal framework, particularly if you're handling money. So there has to be some, and Hayley, you've got that regulatory accountability. There has to be some regulation around it. So when you're talking about it, Rob's just put some issues around clarity. So I think when you're talking about networks, governance, when you're working with your members on it, don't assume people understand what these terms mean. You know, go back to the start with them. So when we've got the when you've got the challenges for governance networks, is that people are mostly focused on this monitoring and controlling type of management. So when you've got organisations that are coming in to be partners in a network, or even individual members, they come out of this structure, which tends to be reasonably secretive, not really holding things to account. So when things go wrong, I don't see governance structures solving that on the whole. So that's the model you're coming out of, and that's one of the challenges when you're going into networks, because we're talking about the proper use of those words and then the proper processes around those words. So we've got these, your networks, because you're autonomous in them and you rely on cooperation, then your governance structure has to stick in terms of people feeling that they can contribute and that it's meaningful for them. And Liz was saying here that bureaucracy can emerge. And as you get into more managed networks, I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, you'll find that bureaucracy can emerge. It's really, really important to be cognizant of reviewing how governance is working in relation to your purpose and to members' needs. So your governance has to address the sustainability. Some of you were interested in that earlier on. It has to be in service to the impact for members. So those are the issues I've just talked about, and you can see that there are 3 ways I'm going to talk to you about how you do governance in networks. They're very different depending on the type of network you've got. So I don't know if you're familiar with these forms. I don't find many people in the NHS know much about them, so I'm just going to whiz through those briefly. So if you've got a relatively small network, now I don't know how big the networks are that you're in or if you're leading networks, but if you could think about a network where people really know each other and trust, so where it says high density there, that first network governance form, which is called shared governance, where you haven't got a huge amount of members, where you're really clear what your purpose is. And so you really feel in it together and you know each other well. It feels a bit more like a family. Then you can get into a shared governance process, and that's basically where all members take responsibility for the governance of the whole, so that any governance decisions are taken fully and transparently in front of all the members, and all members contributed. So it's a complete peer-based structure. It's really interesting because it makes the most of diversity. So you have to be able to do that realistically, and where we often find that in those networks they tend to be focused on learning or advocacy. The second sort is where you have a lead organisation. So often these are delivery networks, so networks that are there in order to deliver services. So if you're thinking about something at scale, so a moderate number, where you've got a shared purpose, but that may vary slightly between, the understanding of that may wax and wane a bit between members. Where trust is, you've got some, I don't know if you remember from the previous webinars, we talked about the roles people play in networks. There are hubs and there are sort of spokes, but there are brokers, there are connectors, and there are energizers. So where you've got those very key roles and you've got a reasonably large network, then you may, and it's a delivery network and there are partners in it, one of the organizations may take a lead role, particularly around the financial side and the intellectual property side. Now, if you have got a lead organizational model, then that has to be accountable to the network as a whole. So what you can't do is give it to a lead organization, they then suddenly become like a hierarchy in the way they manage it. So you do have to design a process that enables that lead organization to be connected to the whole of the network. And the last one is network administrative organization. So basically the network contracts out its governance, employs an organization to do the sort of shoveling, really, the heavy lifting work around governance. And that's where you've got many members, where the impact of financial or intellectual property is across a larger group of people. So you contract it out. It also means that you don't get into the power dynamics of a lead organization taking a role, but you can subcontract it, and that can be held back into the whole network. So that's quite an interesting process. I don't know whether you've seen those before, but I think that's a really useful way of thinking about what sort of governance you want. So as a network leader, when you're starting to think about how you're going to organize, I think it's worth looking at those roles in networks, thinking how are we going to do work, but then how are we going to be accountable and responsible to each other, and that's the important question here. And then you might think, have we got the capacity, energy to do the peer-based shared governance model, which is ideal and I think the best, because you end up tussling through the real difficult issues around purpose as well, and it really helps networks thrive. The lead organization model can take you into bureaucracy, and the network organization is sort of a pragmatic approach. So it really does depend on these starting conditions, how much trust you have between you, and by trust I mean connectedness, i.e., do I feel confident that my neighbor member is going to do what they said they're going to do? Size, I talked about this how really aligned you are around purpose and what joint action means. The commitment of members, how embedded you feel, and the diversity of your participants, and that really, hopefully, that helps you think about which governance process is right for you. Okay, here's some examples. So this is the National Institute for Health Research. You can see on the right-hand side there, they've got their sort of top management team, and then the left-hand side is how those local clinical research networks are enacted by host organizations. So they have a number of these host organizations, and you can see that looks quite structural, it looks quite hierarchical. So basically, they get their business done because they have got massive amounts of money that they're using in service to research in place and around themes. So they've got quite a strong operational capacity within that network. It's not, this is much more of a managed type network than it is a creative network, but it is a good knowledge sharing network. And you can see they have a partnership group, and they have this right-hand side, which is how the sort of top of the organization works in service to the whole. This is quite an interesting blend. Now, their model of working is a lead organization model. So that's those cogs on the right-hand side. They take overall responsibility for the network, and then the hosts are the lead organizations that govern in relation to those themes. That's one way of thinking about it. Here's another one. This is Health Innovation Network. It's the Academic Health Science Network in London. I don't know if you know it. Have a quick look through how they organise themselves, and I think they're absolutely more a shared governance. They've got their members. All their members make a contribution to the HIN. They help set the priorities. They agree whether the priorities are met. They agree how the work does. Everybody makes contributions. They have a core delivery team, sort of the network hub. But they look out for talent in the network. They help spread knowledge, and that's absolutely what they're about. So very interesting. They've got so you can see that they've got elements of robustness around their program boards, but overall they're trying to provide a more of a shared governance model. So those are some examples, and you can see that the reason why we're in this mode of network governance, we're moving here. Earlier on I told you from the old world into the new world, but we're moving from this old public sector administration. We've done competition, which was new public management. We're now in this more of a network governance model. Accountable care systems are absolute networks. STPs should be networks. The danger of putting a bureaucratic hierarchical model onto those is that it will stifle any ability to get anything done. So if you look at the context of network governance, it's continuously changing. You've got diverse needs. They say you're regulated by loyalty here, which is quite an interesting notion. I think you're regulated by relationships. So I'd probably disagree with that one there. But the theory, if you look at the bottom there, the theory about the way you govern goes from public goods to public choice to public value. And so the way you organize your network governance has to be based on a notion of how you're going to generate value. And that's what I'm going to come on to next. Yeah, the HIN, Carl, you're right. There's academic health science networks across the whole of the UK, but the South London Health Innovation Network is organised it's quite different, I think, from some of the others in terms of how it organises its governance. Okay. So any questions so far just in relation to governance? Or just if you want to pop anything in the chat box. Okay. And Cara, I've seen Cara, you're chatting away a lot, which is great. It's really, you're right, the issue is you need massive amounts of clarity about role, about what people are doing in a network, what impact they're generating, who's responsible for what, where the accountability lies. You're absolutely clear. You're absolutely right. And so the nice thing about this in networks is that these things are contested and always in conversation. And the fact that you're working this all the time, you'll find that, so the fact you're working this all the time means that that in itself generates a clearer set of relationships between members, and it also re-clarifies purpose all the time. B, you're talking about how to, I gave you some examples of ones that are very explicit. I run a number of networks, and we don't have any resources at all, really. So the issue is that nobody takes part in network if it's not working for them. And back to what I was saying about reciprocity, you have to gift and you have to take. And so all networks really work on everybody gifting. So some networks, the HIN has money, NIHR has money. Some networks are learning networks. They're not about money at all. They're about spreading learning with very, very little money. They're not about allocating resources or supporting activity through grants. So if you're thinking about a network that might be a learning network, and you might pop some in the examples in the chat if you've got any. But those sorts of networks are based on this notion of reciprocity, and that means that governance is enacted through the whole. So when you're thinking about how you set up your governance structure, I'm saying it's not necessarily about boards. It's you've got a smaller network that's about learning. It's about those areas I was saying to you earlier on. Let me just whiz back. Okay, these sorts of areas. How you're going to sort some of these, these sorts of issues out between you. How you're going to make decisions about the utilization of your resources. If your resource is intellectual property, or if your resource is your human effort that you're gifting into the network, how do you hold everybody to account for that? That's the question you're asking. I'm going to go into this issue about value and impact because it really relates to that. Okay. I'm just going to have a quick look at what Priya's saying here. Yeah. Okay, so this is an issue, isn't it, about whether you've got a network which is the only thing, or whether a network is part of something else. So some work of STPs is delivered through performance management and through hierarchy, and some is delivered through networks. And that's the challenge I find, in that many organizational leaders don't understand that they're in different ways of organizing for different types of work. And really, because also some of it's done through adaptive systems, not all through networks. So you might want to sort out a loneliness and isolation in the borough of Bow, and that would be an adaptive system. You might want to learn how to support and enable people to have better lives with uncertain heart rhythms, with arrhythmias, and that might be a learning network, and that might be across a much bigger geography. Being clear what's the work, and therefore is it best supported through adaptive system, i.e. place-based stakeholders together in service to a wicked issue? Is it in service to a network which is about learning, amplifying, convening and community building? Or is it about a hierarchy which is about the JFDI version of everybody knows what to do and it's linear? And I think when you're running any organization, you're usually running some through performance management, some things through networks, and some things through adaptive systems. And that's absolutely the case when you're getting into the world of STPs and accountable care systems. When you're talking about, Heather's got a question here. Clarity of roles is difficult and changing. So I would just say that you always focus on. So if you've got a wicked issue, by definition doesn't know what's going to evolve. You're always clear about purpose, Heather. So with a wicked issue, you don't know how to get there, but you know what the thing is that you're trying to have, or you're trying to engage with. So if you're learning back to arrhythmias, let's say, people struggling with arrhythmia, or frailty, there's another really good one. People are very frail. and you're trying, the frailty in place would be an adaptive system, but the learning about frailty and how we do that might be a network. So you don't know what it's going to evolve. It's an inquiry base. That's the really joyful thing about networks, is they're about knowledge generating. So the network as a whole is generating knowledge about this, it's inquiring together, it's learning together. The clarity of roles, the roles are around, back to what I was saying earlier on, around whether people are energizers, whether they're connectors, whether they're boundary spanners, and then you also have the network leader's role. And then so your governance is about what's the process by which we make decisions as a network, as a group of peers in service to this purpose. So governance isn't about trawling through the books on a regular basis in the same way you might find it in a performance management model. You've got to think governance, go back to what we were saying earlier on, it's about how do we make decisions together about our resources. And in this case, when you're thinking about frailty network, learning about and inquiring into frailty, then your resource is probably your time and effort and your intellectual property. And that's the piece you've got to be clear about. What do we do with that? Who owns it? How do we make decisions about whether this is the piece that we're going to go public with or not? Do you see what I mean? It's a very, very different sort of world. Okay, let's get into value and impact. So the most important thing about networks is they have to generate healthful outputs. You don't join a network and take part in a network with all your voluntary capacity unless it's benefiting both you and the network as a whole, and those are completely intertwined. So they absolutely have to be, outputs have to be co-created with and between members, and they have to be helpful to members and to the whole. And this is a really interesting dynamic. But there's something else about networks in the public vein, which is about the value proposition. So what we're talking about is that if you are working in the public domain, i.e. you are employed by the public sector, you're generating goods in service to the public sphere, then it isn't just whether it generates benefits for members and for members individually and collectively, it's also whether it generates public goods, public value, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So and I'm talking about now about networks that are in the public space, so health and social care, so something that the NHS, that the citizens in this country fund. So dimension of public value. I'm just going to talk through what this means, and this means that we're talking about so when you're thinking about, has my network made a difference, you've got to think, has it made a difference, back to our frailty example, has the learning in this network made a difference to our members? Has the learning in this difference made a difference to our purpose, which is, for instance, to ensure that people who are working in frailty have access to the best knowledge there is and can make more difference, something like that. Then you've also got this issue about, so what will the public most value? So if you as a citizen was looking into this network, would you say this network had delivered value to the public sphere? Do you think this has been a useful time and effort that public servants have spent? So given that when you join a network, quite often that means that you're bringing your salary in, your time and effort that could be spent elsewhere. What does the public think about? How would you feel accountable to a wider public good about the work that you're doing? So that's what we have to generate. So when you're thinking about value, we often think about economic value, so labour value. We often think about political value, and we also think about social value. So how do we strengthen social cohesion, social relations, and culture? So one of the issues about public value is that so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a theory about the public value sphere. That public value outcomes are generated in between the state, civil society. So as you're working in a network, you may have in your network, you may have members of the public, you may have ranges of organisations that have very different governance structures themselves. You might be working with the state. So public value gets created in all sorts of places. And when you're thinking about a network generating public value, you've got to think within your network, is that public value being generated through members back in their organisations, or is it being generated collectively by the network as a whole? And you often find that public value is created at the very front line, so where there is the closest relationship between citizens, communities and the environment. And that's why this is an interesting notion about public value, is it's not usually about single organisations, it's usually about partnerships. And Mark Moore, this is a piece that I think is really interesting for any network, which is that when you're thinking about generating value in a network, I think this is a really helpful framework in that you've got to think about what are these relationships that constrain or enable the network delivering value at all. And so we've got these three areas that Mark Moore talks about. And he's really brought that out. I don't know if you know his work, but he started off looking at the corporate sector, which has very strong value propositions, and said he couldn't find it in the public sector particularly. He couldn't find it in not-for-profit organisations. And so he was trying to find out, so he did a sort of study of organisations that work outside the corporate world and said, so what is it that people say about the value that they're generating? Because you don't have shareholders, you can't demonstrate it in quite the same way. So it's what are you accountable for and to who? And that's what he was working on when he talked about this, when he talked about these environments. And he says that when you're thinking about the value you're generating, and you can think now about your network, you've got to think about these three domains. That what are your strategic goals? Are your purposes network? And does that have a public value proposition? Is it clear what value you're adding in that public sphere? And the second thing is, are you cognizant of the authorizing environment? Are the people that could say whether you could or couldn't do the work that you want to do? And do you have the operational capacity in your network to deliver it? And he said these are pretty, there needs to be some alignment between these three areas. But and I'll just give you another example. So the authorizing environment, we're talking about who can say yes or no to what you want to do as a network, and can you give an account to them about the work that you're doing? So when you're thinking about your value proposition, this piece on the right, what is it you're trying to accomplish exactly as a network? And so you've got to think, we have to have some, we say here substantially valuable, you've got to say that we have something of substance that is valuable, both to the members, remember this is about your members individually, your members collectively, and then society at large, because networks in health and care have this notion of being accountable to the wider system. So what's beyond your purpose, what is the exact thing that you're trying to achieve through your network? Who can say yes or no to you doing that work? And so therefore, when you're thinking about your governance process and how you measure impact, you've got to be absolutely cognizant of this authorizing environment. And then, do you have the capacity to do it? Are you really clear that you've got the resources within your network to achieve what you want to achieve? And so this is a really useful framework when you're thinking about impact. So we're going back to, we're setting the governance framework, how you make shared decision making. That's a process. Now use your governance framework to work on this notion of value. What is it that we're trying to achieve? How do we know we've achieved it? And who would care? And when you're thinking about who would you give an account to, you're thinking about those domains I've just been talking about to you, and have we got the capacity to do it? So there are these three questions. Is the purpose publicly valuable? Do you think what you're doing as a network is publicly valuable? Is it operationally possible? And is it politically and legally possible? And we put that political legal framework in, and sometimes we don't always we're not always cognizant about what we're trying to achieve in a wider sphere. So there's some key actions, three key activities when you're thinking about, as a network leader, about how you might work on these questions. You've always got to be thinking about managing upwards and outwards. You were asking earlier on, somebody was asking about sustainability. This is your sustainability question. How are you going to manage the authorizing environment, the political actors, the people around who might be supportive or not of your network? And how are you going to, managing downwards in this sense is more about working together as peers when you translate this to the network world. Okay. So key leadership tasks, be absolutely clear what your value proposition is to your members, with your members, and to this external environment, and be really clear about obsessional focus on outcomes. I love that language, actually, that networks die if you don't have ruthless attention to outcomes. Keep your eye on this authorizing environment. Lead with political awareness. Recognize that you're in a flexing and changing world. Address your stakeholders. Make sure you've got the operational capacity to do it. So when you're thinking about impact, you've got to think about impact, I was saying, to your individual members, i.e., here's an example around learning networks. Is your network generating new knowledge that people are able to translate into practice? That might be the benefit you've got to generate for your network. So how would you know? What are you going to do to measure that? It might be to your member organisations. So they might be looking for resources and materials they can spread within their wider organisation. So that might be their impact, their outcome. Or they might be looking for new partnerships or collaborations. So do you know what your individual member expected impact is, outcomes are, your member expected outcomes? And the funders of the networks, and I would, by that I mean your authorising environment, your public value folks, what might they be interested in terms of securing outcomes? And that, on the whole, networks don't tend to have an eye open for all those different stakeholders. So where do you think your network adds value? Do you think it's adding value to individual members? Do you think it's adding value to your member organisations? Do you think it's adding value to people that pay for the network? And by pay for, I mean wider society, as well as I mean grant funders. So it could be, it could be the public who indirectly pay your salary. None of the above, all the above, or don't know. So can you have a go at that for your network? Where do you think your network adds value? And this is pretty critical now. So we've talked about shared governance, making the decisions, but now I'm talking about over what. Where are you generating value? I'll carry on whilst you're doing your poll. So these are things that networks have to measure: impact in relation to the purpose, members' perception of relationships, and how effectively they use their resources. So when you're thinking back here, we're talking about how you might add value. So this is the outcomes. So you measure your outcomes, that impact relates to the network purpose. You then have to also, as networks, in terms of ensuring that your network is viable and sustainable, you have to take the temperature of your members. I'm going to come to that in a minute. You've got to be absolutely clear how you're using your resources. That's your governance piece. And then the last piece that I haven't put on there, which I should have done, sorry everybody, is that you have to generate how much your network is learning. It's a really critical part of it. So how do you secure, when you're doing this measurement piece, how you're using that to learn and adapt as a network? So how does this intelligence come back into the network? Okay, so you've got some sense that you're meeting, some of you are meeting all of the above, some of you are answering, some of you are meeting members, some of you are meeting individual needs. And the issue is, for this question back here, you have got to be meeting everybody's needs, the individual members, the members' organisations, and the wider stakeholder, people who think they're generating some value. Here's an example from the Co-Creation Network. You can barely see it, I know, but you'll get some sense. They've written their impact category on the left, how they're going to measure it, and then what impacts they identify, and they use that for a conversation in the Co-Creation Network about how well they've done. That's an example. Now, in our diagnostics, you'll find this on the website. You can go into diagnostics and you can join your network up for these diagnostics. But we've got a number of tools there. Now, one of the tools is this, which is a network scorecard. This is where you can survey your members and do that temperature testing. Do they think you're achieving what you should be achieving? Because one of the issues about generating value is that your members have to know you're generating value. So there's no point generating it and then no one needs to know what's going on. And you'll find that you can do this on the website. It sends out an email. People click on all your members can do this. They can all take the survey. It's a validated survey, so it's research-based in terms of all the elements of a network. You get results like this that you can share with your network members. So this is a really good way of knowing both if you're generating impact, do your members know about it, and have you got a thriving network membership that would enable you? Have you got the conditions that enable you to generate impact? Now, this is another one. This is about the maturity you might have in generating impact. So one of the things we know about networks is that they're at different stages. So they're often just getting going, a catalyzing stage. They might be launching, they might be in the organizational phase, or they might be actually now performing and adapting. So you might be a very new network, or you might be a really, really well-heeled network. Now, you can see that in terms of your value and impact, we've given you a scale on the maturity matrix on the website, but you can have a look now and say, where do you think you sit at the moment? So right at level 1, impact's not really discussed. Members are a bit of a club, and no one takes responsibility. Right up to level 5, where members and stakeholders alike understand the impact. All those 3 domains are being addressed. members are proud of their accomplishments. They know if anybody stopped them in the street, they could say absolutely why they're in the network, what it's doing. They can repeat its successes. And your wider stakeholders, think about that public value group, your authorizing environment, they're absolutely clear and they've got stories about the impact you're making. Okay, have you had a chance to have a look at that yet? Quick look and see if you have. Okay. All right, so what level are you? Is the next poll. Where do you think you are in terms of your network? What impact do you think you're making? So in terms of generating value and impact, where are you? And my experience is, because the NHS says it's evidence-driven but doesn't tend to be, on the whole we find that people are less rigorous in networks. They do lots of network work, but they're not at all rigorous about these issues about tracking impact, collecting stories, generating data about it, and feeding that back and sharing that across the network as a whole in order to adapt as a network, but also wider stakeholders. And then they don't also necessarily have the governance framework to create this level of shared decisions about the resources that come out of this type of conversation. So hopefully you're busy polling away. Okay, got it? All righty, now in the final seconds, I'll come back to this in a second. Wonderful. Okay, let's have a look. Where are you? Quite a few of you at level 3. That's really great, because you've got at least some beginning of an understanding. So you've got to build on that. There's not many of you up at level 5, and there's some of you further down. But I would really start pulling your network into being much, much more rigorous about these areas. Because the last piece, this is how it looks on the website. This is what you do on the website when you want to track this whole maturity. You can have a look yourself. But this is what happens. This is when networks work. They work when there's shared purpose, where they're creative, when they meet members' needs, but very importantly, when they generate helpful outputs. And they fail when they're over-managed, when some members are predicated, and when they have a lack of impact. Okay, I've cantered through the credit. We've got 3 minutes running questions at the very, very end. So do put any remaining questions up in the chat box now. And what we'll do is we'll add those polls. Rachel, if you send them to me, I'll add them to the slide deck, and then I'll repost the whole lot up on SlideShare so that you can see your results as well. Rob says he needs something to note exit survey. You put your questions up there, and I'm going to slide on to this. Here we go. Okay, that one, Rob?
Okay, thank you very much, Becky. As I said at the beginning of the introduction, there was a lot in there, some really useful information, and I'm sure stuff that's given people a lot of cause for reflection over what they actually mean when they talk about a network. So there's a few things that people can do as a result of this webinar. Obviously, one of the things we'd like you to do is register on the platform, and we've given you the link there. And as I said at the front end, we're going to run a Q&A session on the community section of the website. So hope to see lots of you there. And sign up for the final webinar in December. For those of you who are on the platform, or register on the platform as a network leader, register the network and use the diagnostics. Particularly for those who are doing the large-scale change webinars, then as the webinar closes, there will be the exit survey, and you not only need to answer the sort of responses to the overall webinar itself, but particularly respond to the questions that will provide for your CPD points if you have attended and completed all those questions for all of the webinars. We're very, very close to time, and I know that there is a very firm agreement for people that we would actually finish on time. So at that point, I would say thank you very much indeed for all who've attended. Lots of lively chat, various questions that we will respond to, and join us on that Q&A section in the community section on the Source for Networks platform. Thank you, and particularly Becky, thank you very much.